afternoon, everybody. Welcome to our webinar today, Policy Musings on Inequality. Why is inequality so hard to fix? My name is Amber Hawes, and I'm the Communications and Marketing Coordinator here at Essential Skills Ontario. So before we get started, I just want to give you a few instructions. At the right-hand side of your screen is your GoToWebinar dashboard. There you can ask questions in the question pane, so if you have any technical questions, type them in there and I'll try to assist you. And if you have any questions pertaining to the webinar itself, feel free to ask any time, and then at the end of the webinar, John will address these questions. And if you'd like to participate on Twitter, please use the hashtag ESOWeb. So before we start, I'd like to introduce our presenter. John Stapleton worked for the Ontario government in the Ministry of Community and Social Services and its predecessors for 28 years in the areas of social assistance policy and operations. During his career, John was a senior policy advisor to the Social Assistance Review Committee and the Minister's Advisory Group on New Legislation. His more recent government work concerned with the implementation of the National Child Benefit. He is a commissioner with the Ontario Soldiers' Aid Commission and is a volunteer with St. Christopher House and Wood Green Community Services of Toronto. John was research director for the Task Force on Modernizing Income Security for Working-Age Adults in Toronto and was the co-chair of the working group associated with this project. He is undertaking an innovation fellowship with the Metcalf Foundation, and he teaches public policy and is a member of 25N5. So now, John, I'll pass it over to you for the presentation.
Okay, thanks very much, Amber. This is a long and challenging presentation. Don't be afraid of the fact that it has 50 slides, and about 11 of them are just heading slides. So I'm going to try and spend about 40 or 50 seconds per slide to leave some opportunity for us to talk. So our agenda today is, first of all, 2 books to read together. Rogoff and Haidt, I'll say a bit more about them. 3 leaders on taxes, deficits, and the unequal world our children will inherit. The difficult policy frame of inequality, and this was brought on to us by progressives. It's a negative abstraction with no absolute solution, so that's important. We're going to talk a bit about how civil society justifies inequality, proportionality between pay scales as an issue, and talk about how gross domestic product is the happiest number because it is agnostic to inequality. GDP doesn't care at all about inequality. I want to say a bit about that because GDP is the number we use for almost everything to say how we're doing. And inequality is a consequence of policymaking. No one sets out to create inequality. That's the way it's phrased. We don't talk about equality anymore the way we used to back in the 60s and in times gone by. We talk about inequality, and so that's become a particular issue. And a new recipe for inequality: don't let any government default on its debt. And finally, why inequality continues. I'm going to give you Jonathan Haidt's answer. He's a guy who does TED Talks and has written this wonderful book. And I wished I'd written it myself, but he got to it first. And then finally, a bit on the lives of today's seniors, how they're better or worse. And possibly one solution being a new dialogue with the gerontocracy. That is a term coined by Frank Graves of ECOS, and it's a really interesting term. So the 2 books, there's lots of good tandem reads. I mean, there's Why We Get Fat and Wheat Belly. Those are 2 good books that go together really well. But I found that if you read This Time It's Different by Rogoff and Reinhardt and The Righteous Mind by Jonathan Haidt, they're 2 books that really complement each other. So Ken Rogoff and Carmen Reinhardt, these are economists, and they call their book This Time Is Different. Rogoff is famous for a particular type of analysis of inequality, and he talks a lot about booms and busts. But the important thing he says about booms and busts is that these bubbles that get created, we have to be in denial that we're creating them, and that's part of the actual essence of a bubble. And of course, bubbles create all kinds of inequality. So they say that it's not really about this time being different. They're parodying the phrase, this time it's different. And what they're saying is it's about how we have these crashes and bubbles. And each one that we've had, and especially the current one that we're just digging ourselves out from, the crash of 2008, is a type of bubble that's happened many, many times before in many, many places. And many countries have defaulted on their debts. There's about 200 countries in the world, but there's only 5 countries that have defaulted on their debt. And maybe I'll let you think about what they are, and I'll tell you later which ones they are. The second book is called The Righteous Mind. I really recommend it. How Good People Are Divided by Politics and Religion by Jonathan Haidt. The URL is there for it. And he himself is a liberal social democrat, but he has been, in many ways, darling of conservatives. Margaret Wente in the Globe and Mail wrote about him and talked about the moral palette of the conservative, which we're going to talk a little bit about. And that explains why we have as much inequality as we do, because we have a narrative that supports inequality. So, is this time really different? If you think of game theory and think about the boxing matches, some people talk about the neoliberal round, talk about the welfare state round. The post-war period was certainly the welfare state round, and then of course we had the neoliberal round, which is sort of cutting everything back and trying to shrink the size of governments and that sort of thing. So this all these various rounds continue in terms of the economic cycles that create inequality, bubbles, business cycles, and throughout all of these, elites tend to prosper. But when you're really, when you have Great Depressions and 2 world wars, those were the times when there was an awful lot of default, and when there's default, then the world becomes much more equal, and we're going to see a couple of graphs that show that. So Rogoff shows inequality is highest when default is disallowed, and of course we're certainly disallowing default right now. Think of Greece, and we really have to think about to whom are the dollars owed. All these dollars that that people are lending countries. Well, you usually find out that it is those who have money in the first place, and those at the top in the 1% and the 1/10 of 1% are in many cases those who would get paid back. So we have a system that makes sure the countries and sovereign debts, or sovereign wealth funds and things like that don't default, so that the rich are always paid off. So it's an interesting analysis. So when we get to The Righteous Mind, if you don't have enough money to pick up the $40 to pick it up, then there are 2 chapters in there. One is called Beyond Weird Morality, and the other one is The Conservative Advantage. And if chapters are indigo, we'll let you. You can sit and read them while in the store, and these will really give you the basics of how he, as a liberal social democrat, and people are generally progressive, he makes the point that over the course of history, that liberal social democrats, progressive people who generally populate our liberal and NDP parties, have been a real minority in terms of how they think. And that's kind of interesting, because often those of us who think of ourselves as progressive, we will often think in terms of ourselves being in a majority. And we may well be, but at the same time in history we have not been, and that's the interesting part. So I said I would talk about 2 books, now 3 leaders, and those 3 leaders are Reagan, Bush, and Harper. And I got a bonus from Mitt Romney from his speech, but I'm going to take some excerpts of 3 different speeches and think about inequality when you're hearing. I won't try to do the accent stuff. So for Ronald Reagan, he said at his inaugural, almost 32 years ago in January. So in January of '81, he said, "But great as our tax burden is, it has not kept pace with public spending. For decades, we have piled deficit on deficit, mortgaging our future and our children's future for the temporary convenience of the present." So we're bad people in the present, and because we're indebted and we're enjoying this great lifestyle. And to continue this long trend is to guarantee tremendous social, cultural, political, and economic upheaval. So he was talking about reducing the size of government. You reduce the size of government and reduce taxes. You put it back into the hands of those who had the money in the first place, and that is a recipe for inequality. Now, George Bush said in his radio address in 2006, and I really love this one, the debate in Congress over taxes ultimately comes down to this. Who knows best how to use your money, the politicians in Washington or you? I believe the money we spend in Washington is your money. So it's not the government's money, it's your money, not the government's money. says it over and over again. I trust you to make the best decisions about what you do with your hard-earned dollars, because when you do, your family is better off, our economy grows, and prosperity and opportunity spread throughout this great land. So again, that orthodoxy, the idea that if you just give money back to people and take it away from government, the government has unproductive money, the private sector and you have the good money, then everything is better. Again, another recipe for inequality. And not to be left out, Canadian content here, Stephen Harper at the G8 Summit. So this isn't an offhand remark. This is something that's right in the speech and was planned. You know, there are two schools of economics on this. One is that there is some good taxes, and the other is that no taxes are good taxes. I'm in the latter category. I don't believe that any taxes are good taxes. Okay, Mr. Reagan got in twice. George Bush got in twice. Mr. Harper's in his third term and a majority government. So you can say things like this, talking about lesser government, more money going back to people, fewer taxes, and you can say them unequivocally. There is no hedging here or hedging type of saying, well, maybe they're good at certain times. The people who have actually led us and who continue to lead us are people who are very much pursuing policies that will lead to inequality. So it's really no mystery. So at Mitt Romney's acceptance speech, I'm just going to run these through his various different things that he says, but basically it's all talking about he's going to raise taxes, he's going to cut the military, he's going to take money out of Medicare to put in Obamacare, and then run trillion-dollar deficits. And he said, you know, it's the majority of Americans who now believe that the future will not be better than the past. I can guarantee you this: if Barack Obama is reelected, you'll be right. So. You know, it's really a situation where, in terms of trying to sell the message, you're trying to say you're not going to be better off, but you're selling a message that says you are going to be better off somehow if government programs are actually reduced. And so that's a very difficult sell to make. Romney was unsuccessful at it, but really you got to say it. You got to keep the two messages separately, because Ronald Reagan was famous for saying, are you better off? And yet at the same time, the one side of him is saying, are you better off, thinking you should be better off, and then the other side he's saying, hey, wait a sec, you can't be better off because you're just doing this for the temporary convenience of today. The best politicians, the best conservative politicians are ones who can play both sides of the game, and they have proven that very strongly in terms of their of having policies that will lead to greater inequality. Now, for us as policymakers, and now we start the real policy musings on inequality, progressives have put forward the idea as a negative abstraction. In other words, we're not talking about preserving equality anymore. We're talking about reducing inequality. That's very, very important, because this negative abstraction that we have as inequality is something that doesn't really have any positive solution. So from a public policy perspective, inequality is like homelessness. It's a negative that indicates an absence of something, but in this case, equality. But for homelessness, it's a negative, but it's not an abstraction. It's a negative concrete. So in other words, if we provide housing for people, then they're no longer homeless. You have a solution, and then all the supports that go with that. So inequality being negative has a further problem of being an abstraction. And because it doesn't have an absolute solution, nobody's calling everybody to be equal. Nobody's calling for everybody to have the exact same salary, the exact same money, that if we were to just take everybody across society and say you're all going to be paid, I don't know, $32,000 a year. I mean, nobody's calling for that type of solution, or at least I haven't heard it. We've been talking about some sort of proportionality solution. So it's a bit different, because the answer is not to make everyone equal, whereas the answer to homelessness is to have everybody to have a home. That's the point. And inequality. So we have to take a negative abstraction and turn it into a positive, concrete thing, and that's hard to do in policy terms. So our answer is always to reduce inequality. We're always talking about reducing inequality, but we don't have any absolute positive, concrete way to do that. no one really knows by how much inequality should be reduced, and I'm going to pursue this in a little bit. Especially on the pay scale solution to inequality, it's a bit of a trap. And I'm going to show you and I'm going to just put it all out here in the interest of time. This is from June 6th. This is in Hansard in Ontario, and our former mayor of Toronto, John Sewell, said he was trying to reduce inequality. And Peter Sherman from the Conservative Party says, well, tell us a little bit more about that. What he basically says in the next piece is that we used to have, salaries of the top people that were about 5 times greater than people at the bottom, and he says now we're getting 8 or 9 times higher. And he says at the end of his nose, we've got to reduce. This is the only way we're going to get a better society. But Peter Sherman comes back, and he's a current sitting MPP in Ontario. He says, interesting, because I think you and I grew up at the same times, and I came from a relatively modest family. I could even say poor and not be stretching at the point. And it says, at this time, I'm not a rich man, but I'm not a poor one either. No risk reward. What do you think of that adage? And of course, Sewell says, I'm not quarreling with that at all. So what we have here is a situation where somebody's trying to concretize the solution to inequality by saying that we should have the top salary at 5 times the lowest salary. So Sewell made an excellent case that has real resonance for many of us, and some are trying to work along these lines of having of a salary-based solution. And again, from policy perspective, we're trying to turn inequality from its origin as a negative abstraction into a positive, concrete course of action. Very, very, very important. But any of us who wish to reduce inequality will have to tackle the policy dilemma of turning the negative abstraction into a positive and concrete course of action. And after all, that's what policymaking is all about. So, former Premier Ed Schreier, who was also Governor General, was the first public leader to invoke the pay scale solution. He said back in the 70s that the top CEOs shouldn't make 2.5 times more than a worker, and he was just pilloried for it. Mr. Sewell put the ratio at 5 to 1. But surface-level public opinions. The problem is concerning biography, effort, so that no risk, no reward thing, family, fame, study, risk, reward, personal choice, think of the comment section of the paper. They all figure into the cacophony of the way we use of society and the way we judge people's worth. And Peter Sherman's response to Mr. Sewell actually brings this out very well, and we have many of those sorts of conversations in our political sphere. But while we're doing that and talking about all of this, the CEOs are still pulling away because the CEOs are in sort of a different world, their own world of CEO pay. They make 10 times, 20 times, 30 times, 100 times, and 1,000 times what wage earners make. And I can tell you the Star just had the top 100 CEO earnings in the paper. You know, all the bank presidents are all over $10 million a year. You know, much more than you need to live your whole lifetime. And out of that top 100, I'll just point out there was 1 woman, so 99 men. So there's also other gender things going on, as we all know. So now we have Tim Cook, the CEO of Apple, and I know anybody can point out that his pay just dropped to $4 million a year. I don't know how I'll get along at all, but last year he made $378 million, and this is about $1.1 million a day. It's nice pay if you can get it. So he makes about, what, 47,000 single welfare recipients would receive. Sat down and did a little bit of calculator work. And so just think about that 47,000 to 1. So while Mr. Sewell or Mr. Schreier were talking about 2.5 to 1 and 5 to 1, and any of us could say, well, it should never be more than 1,000 to 1, we have Tim Cook last year at 47,000 to 1. So civil society, though, generally looks at proportionality between pay scales. And going to Jonathan Haidt, what he talks about in his book is that the conservative mindset sees equality solutions as proportionality between groups as opposed to equality overall. We don't compare ourselves, at least I don't compare myself to a baseball player and a hockey player. They're off in some other different world. They make millions per year, and I know I'm never going to make that kind of money, and they're just in that world where millionaires have been negotiating with billionaires very lately. The proportionality debate, though, always comes down to people to whom you compare yourself, and that's why we're often talking about, well, gee, why should these union people be getting their medical plan, and why should the teachers get their sick pay tied off? Because we tend, as a general public, to compare ourselves to people. We're comparing like to like. We're in the same ballpark as those people, no pun intended. And that's why we start talking about them as opposed to talking about the CEOs who tend to be in this different world. So this is the basics of what Haidt sees as the conservative mindset, this idea of circles. And you talk about equality within those circles, but not equality between them. I'm going to come back to that in a bit, but I just want to say a little bit about GDP. It's the big number that we use, gross domestic product, and it's the happiest number we have. And the reason it's the happiest number is because it's agnostic to inequality. In other words, you could have a country where everybody's equal, and it could have the same GDP as a country that had profound inequality, where the king owned everything and everybody else was slaves and serfs, for example, and they could have the same GDP. But in terms of the well-being of the people, they would be entirely, entirely different. And yet we continue to use the term GDP. So we do as a society accept one overall indicator of growth. This is gross domestic product. It's the only measure that's absolutely pervasive in almost everything we do. If I think, or at least think, if I was able to stop the next 100 people walking down Yonge Street and ask the question, what is GDP, would they be able to correctly define it? Would they get it right? Because what it is the market value of all officially recognized final goods and services produced within a country in a given period. So that means everything you spend, everything government spends, everything business spends, all goes into this one figure called GDP. And whether you spend more and I spend more, or you spend less and I spend less, really doesn't matter as much. It all totals up to one figure. And that's kind of interesting, especially when you think of the disconnect between the mindset that says government expenditures are wasteful and private sector spending is important, investment spending. As far as GDP is concerned, it's all just spending and it all counts. So going back to my people down Yonge Street, would they also know what is not included in GDP, for example, that I could volunteer for Wood Green for 25 years and I don't contribute 1 cent to GDP, but if someone sells a volunteer a magazine through telemarketing, then that contributes to GDP. So how we look at our well-being and how we look at our productivity is a money measure, and it's an agnostic money measure, and it just doesn't care about where the money comes from or where the money goes. As long as it's spent and as long as I can count for it, it's going to go into GDP. And if you have an indicator like that, it's going to send you towards inequality because the number doesn't care about it. So in the lower the right, private sector spending is called growth. The government sector says it's detracting from growth, but GDP doesn't care. The GDP number can come from anywhere. Yet isn't that what Mr. Harper and Mr. Reagan were saying? It's your money, and your money grows. Private money grows, and if the money goes from government as bad money back to you as good money, then all of a sudden you have good money. And so even though we don't understand GDP, because collectively we don't seem to understand that it doesn't matter where the money is spent or where it comes from, we have an orthodoxy within this which says that government money is bad and private money is good. And so government money takes, yet GDP as a measure of expenditures at all sources. And of course that's what creates these narratives that we have in our civil society, and all of those also contribute to an acceptance of inequality, in my view. So does this mean as a public we don't understand what GDP is? Well, absolutely. The most important part about GDP is that the GDP, as I said, is agnostic to inequality. GDP figures stay exactly the same whether inequality goes up or down. All other indices of well-being do not measure up. They can't. So if we have a Canadian Index of Well-being, if we have any sort of index at all of well-being, it's always going to underperform GDP and therefore always make GDP the happiest number. Because indices of well-being implicitly take equality into account, you get a guy like Tim Cook making $378 million while it takes 47,000 social assistance recipients to receive the equivalent of his salary. An index of well-being has to include all of those social assistance recipients, not just Tim Cook. Tim Cook is firing on all cylinders when it comes to well-being, or at least he could, because he's got enough money to, but the 47,000 social assistance recipients do not. So if you bring any sort of index of social reality into this in terms of how people are actually doing, it's always going to underperform the GDP number because the GDP number is going to include the very richest among us, and the very richest among us really don't need an index of well-being. They're always going to score well in good times or bad times. So in a well-being index, remember, Tim Cook is just one guy. In the GDP measure, he is worth 47,000 poor people. I mean, that just says it all. So GDP per capita numbers in New York and Ohio, guess what, are higher than Ontario's. And yet we look at these pictures of the housing in Cleveland that's being turned out, that's being bulldozed, and we say, is this really what we want to be like because their GDP is higher? Well, really, there are about 10 to 20,000 people in New York and Ohio that are making so much money that their GDP is actually higher. And yet we still have some of the bank economists and others that say, we really got to get ourselves to where New York and Ohio is. Well, what that's kind of saying is it will become a whole lot more unequal. So a good index of inequality could be a simple ratio, any indices of well-being, anything that includes us, all of us, to GDP, but of course GDP is always going to win. So let's recall Galbraith's dictum about the conventional wisdom. There's 4 rules. It has to be simple, understandable, in the frame we understand, and it gives you self-esteem. So all indices of well-being are always going to be more dismal than GDP. So GDP remains that happy number. We like to be happy, and we like things that give us self-esteem, and GDP will always continue to reign as the conventional measure because it is the one that will always give the most self-esteem. Every time the Canadian Index of Well-Being comes out, they say, oh, well, it's scoring, we're doing a lot less well than we thought, and that sort of thing. That's not a measure that will attract people. So just to remind ourselves, too, that inequality is a consequence of policy making. No one sets out to create it. We do not have overt public policies designed to make people rich. Aside from lotteries, we don't have people sitting around a cabinet table or a city council devising ways to make just a few of us wealthy. And we don't have governments sitting around think tanks thinking about how we can just make a handful of rich beyond our wildest dreams. We don't have academics who do that either. So whenever we talk about public policy to end inequality, it's more about bringing people up and bringing them down, because you know, it's really all of our policy making. There's no overt policies that we can really bring to say we just want to reduce inequality, or no overt policies that we make to increase inequality. It's always a consequence of the policies, and that, of course, makes things more difficult. It's not about making the poor rich, and we have to look at policies designed other things that produce inequality, and therefore equality as a consequence of those policies. This makes the abstraction more abstract and makes solutions harder to come by. So we really set ourselves in a pickle by framing it as inequality. But that doesn't mean that it's not insurmountable. So a new recipe for inequality: don't let any governments default on their debts. Rogoff and Reinhardt, back to them again, talk about the fact of the thousands and thousands of sovereign and non-sovereign defaults that have taken place over the centuries. There's only 5 countries that have never defaulted. Canada, yay. The U.S., well, it can't default because it's banker to the world's commodities and currencies, and all those commodities and currencies can't fail, and they're in the enviable position to be able to send pictures of dead presidents on pieces of paper to people and get real stuff in return. So they're hardly ever, they will not default. The UK inflated itself out of its monetary problems, but it's never defaulted, and New Zealand and Switzerland haven't defaulted. But the real lesson there is that if there's 200 countries in the world, which is what there is about, we've got about 195, about, you know, a very, very high percent, about 97% of countries that have defaulted at one time or another. And Canadian provinces have defaulted. Newfoundland defaulted in the 30s, and that's why, in part, that England, the UK wanted to give it away to Canada. Saskatchewan defaulted, Alberta defaulted, and all other countries have defaulted. So Krugman, in his book, End This Depression Now, explains that many people believe that much of the money comprises our debts is owed to China. Well, China turns out to own about 6% of it, so that means 94% is owed to its own people. And just remember, just as a thought experiment, that Margaret Atwood says in her great book Payback, she says, if the world were to end tomorrow, all debts are settled. So interesting that we managed to, in many ways, have these crises of debt and crisis of deficits at the same time as in some ways, they're self-created crises in the sense that we expect everybody to pay the money back. So even though it's factually not the case that the money is owed to China, it's interesting that people would think we owe the money to China, and Mitt Romney certainly said that in practically all of his speeches. We actually owe each other the most. Those who have money are the counterparties to borrowers. So if we have people who have money and they are the 1%, then those are they are the counterparties to the borrowers, and of course they all want to get paid back. And they show us things like the debt clock. That's a screenshot of the debt clock, but it's a fun thing to look at. So when default is permitted, greater equality starts to prevail. Very, very interesting. For example, in the charts in This Time is Different that shows defaults over the decades, it's almost a mirror image of the charts that many economists have shown us depicting the Gilded Age before the 1920s and the new Gilded Age that is emerging now. Now that's a bit of an abstract thought, so I'm going to try and show it in the graph. That is, when defaults are low, the Gilded Age rides high. When defaults are high, the Gilded Age goes into retreat. Interesting. So here we go. Here's the 200-year-long chart from 1800 up to now, showing these periods where you have almost all, where you have real, especially through big world wars and insurrections and things like that, and Great Depressions, you're going to have the most default. So interesting, if you look at this period now from about 1910 and take us up through the 40s and 50s, we had a tremendous amount of defaults after the First and Second World Wars. And we had much, much greater equality because those that had money didn't get paid. That's kind of interesting. And then if we show the top 0.1% compared to the top marginal tax rate, we can see also that taxes have a huge role in this. When taxes are very high, you can see that inequality is much lower with higher taxes. But the other part of the story is that when you go into a period like we have now where there's almost, we won't let anybody default, especially in the Eurozone. There's been very little country defaults over the last while, maybe the last one being Argentina. Then we have a buildup in wealth of those who are wealthy in the first place. So, want to switch gears again. Why inequality continues, according to Jonathan Haidt, going back to these first two books again. So what Haidt says is that people who are liberal progressives and social democrats have a moral palette comprised of two great concerns. The first is care. Care for others and care for the fact that we think about the poor. We think about people who are less well off than us. And the other part of our moral palette of progressives is fairness. So fairness and care top the list. But why inequality continues, Haidt's answer is this. He goes on to talk about the moral palette of the conservative also have caring and fairness in their moral palette, but caring and fairness for them come at the bottom. There are 4 other components for conservatives within that moral palette. The first is sanctity, so of and having to do with holiness and religion. Loyalty, in other words, who we care, our loyalty to our flag, our country, our military, etc. Liberty, in other words, liberty comes very high, the idea that you are free to do something, and that is always exploited in terms of the anti-tax agenda, that if you get more of your money back, you're free to spend it your way, not the way the government would spend it for you, which is taken nominally as something that you would disagree with. And then authority, that you believe in the authority and leadership of your rulers and those who would protect you from harm. So the conservative moral palette shows sanctity, loyalty, liberty, and authority at the top, and caring and fairness at the bottom. So sanctity is the state or quality of being wholly sacred or saintly, the ultimate importance and inviolability of human life. Loyalty is a steadfast allegiance to one's homeland, government or sovereign, faithful to a person, ideals, custom, cause, or duty. Authority is the power or right to give orders, make decisions, enforce obedience, the right to act in a specified way, delegated from one person or organization from another, and liberty is the state of being free within society from oppressive restrictions. So that is what the conservative moral palette is, and with those 4 on top. And liberty also includes a right or privilege. So it's interesting to think about sanctity, loyalty, liberty, and authority tend to be parts of our moral palette that worry less about equality and worry less about inequality. Yet for the progressive, when you think of fairness and caring, those are things that naturally accrue to a concern for inequality and to create greater equality. So again, another explanation in terms of the policy landscape of why we would accept inequality. And I just want to say a little bit about today's seniors. They live through really the very best of times. These are people who generally retired in the 70s and 80s. They have really benefited from the stock market. First of all, they benefited from the welfare state as we knew it, and as it started to be dismantled, they lived through the best parts of it, and at the same time lived through the best investment years where stock markets went up about 10 times. So they had some things tough and believe they lived in the toughest of all times, because you usually make the assessment of tough times in your youth. But in their prime saving years, they had the best of times. The big stall relates to the present generation. Markets are basically where they were in 1998. But if you go the 14 years or the 13 years before 1998, the stock market went up about 5 times. So the present generation is facing stagnant investments, higher costs, withering infrastructure and services. And if you just look at, this is the Dow Jones Industrial Average going back 25 years, you see that real rise up through 80s into about 98, 99. And then where we see it now, here we are about, you look at 98 and the Dow was up to about between 11 and 12,000. And we get into 2013, and it's just above 13,000, so a very small percentage gain versus what it did in the period before that. So maybe one solution, especially as we talk, and remember there's one fact, one really important fact, and that is that seniors over 65 vote at 6 times the rate of under 25s. So think of a 36-foot senior and think of a 6-foot 24-year-old. The voting power of that senior is 6 times the other. And seniors tend to vote conservative, so it's going to bring in parties. It's going to, whether it's Rob Ford, whether it's the conservative leanings of Ontario's Liberal Party, or whether it's the Harper Conservatives, you can see in all cases that that's very much benefited from the senior voter and the lack of voting on the part of younger people. But to conclude, it will be very important to connect to this gerontocracy that actually runs us right now. And it's hard to talk about because if we could just get the under 25s to vote in the same proportion of the over 65s, we'd have very different governments. But alas, that does not seem to be. If we ask seniors if they're going to vote, they say they are, and they do. If we ask 24-year-olds whether they're going to vote, they always say they are, but then don't. So in many ways, we'll have to find a way to have a dialogue with the gerontocracy and talk to them in new ways about reducing inequality. We have to respect and understand their views about sanctity, liberty, authority, and loyalty, because that's really the values that they pay attention to. Going to them and saying, gee, things are unfair, or geez, don't you care, that's not gonna, it's not really going to make way with them, because they have these other values as part of their moral palette. If we continue to hector an unbelieving generation of seniors about fairness and caring, and especially on the right, we will continue to talk to ourselves, and for those that vote, who vote for inequality as a consequence, will feel justified in doing so. So anyways, I wanted to get through it. I know I've gone very, very quickly through a presentation that I could easily do in 2 hours, but I wanted to make sure that we had opportunities for questions and dialogue.
Okay, hi John. So this is just a reminder to everyone that if you have any questions for John, just type them into your question pane on the GoToWebinar dashboard. So we do have a few questions here for you, John. Back to the beginning, why does Jonathan Haidt believe that liberal Democrats have historically been the minority?
The reason Haidt gives in his book, this is easy for me because I can just say what's in the book. He basically goes on to say that throughout history, the values of liberty, sanctity especially, we've generally been much more religious people in the past, loyalty and authority have dominated the moral palettes of most societies. And the emergence of fairness and caring as dominant, which is true in the liberal social democrat and in the progressive, are very hard to find in other societies, and very, very hard to find in societies of yesteryear. So that's his point when he goes through and does his analysis. When he takes those 6 elements of our moral palette, he says for most societies, at most times, in most places, liberty, loyalty, sanctity, and authority have topped the list, and the current group of progressives that have fairness and caring is very high are in this minority.
Okay, great. I have another question here. The fact that pretty much everyone has defaulted on their debt with little consequences, does that mean that this system is kind of pointless?
They kind of, well, there's two that we see. Haidt and Reinhardt are trying to make 2 huge points. First of all, that every time an economy starts to grow a bubble, whether it's a real estate bubble, as what happened in the U.S., or whether it's a stock bubble that happened before the Great Depression, or any times the gold has gone to it went to $800 in 1980, and then 20 years later, gold selling for $200 an ounce. Anytime we have these bubbles that send prices roaring, there's always this sense in which there's a group of people who will justify it and say, well, this time it's different. Things have changed, and they've changed for good. Well, they point out in their book historically that every time you have one of these bubbles, that they crash. And governments, in many instances, what they're really trying to say to governments is it's not pointless. That what you should do is start from the point of view is that this time it is not different. And when you start to see, and you see in terms of public policy right now that Mr. Flaherty has reversed all of the changes he made that allowed easier money to go into the housing market. The big, so if we do realize that we're growing a bubble in no matter what it is, there's a good case to be made to say, to start off with the idea, this time it's not different. This was going to blow, is going to burst just like everything else, and therefore go on a path of governance, and especially with money supply and with monetary policy that will disallow a country to very much suffer from a bubble breaking. I mean, look at, we got Spain now at 26% unemployment and youth unemployment like in the 30s and 40%. It's really it's a situation where they allowed that bubble to burst, and not just them, and sometimes somebody else allows the bubble to burst, and with their own particular policies, and then it hurts everybody else. I mean, Ed Clark, is the president of the Toronto-Dominion Bank, basically said, speaking to his world of bankers, saying we blew up the world. And they did. They simply allowed a whole lot of worthless assets to grow and grow and grow until finally there was no market for them. And then we have a horrendous stock market crash and a recession of the likes that we're still seeing. So if we are more prudent, it's not pointless. We actually can keep these things from happening in the first place. And yet at the same time, if when companies go bankrupt, at the end of the day, all of the stuff that they had gets sold off, and the company doesn't exist anymore. When a country goes bankrupt, you wake up the next morning, the country's still there. People are still having breakfast. Still people go to work. So countries go bankrupt in a very different way than companies go bankrupt. And if you have to let them default for whatever reason, then prolonging it and putting the people in these countries under tremendous hardship just because you want a bond issue to get paid off is, in the final analysis, you can't shrink yourself bigger. If you keep shrinking an economy in the hopes that you're going to get your money back, it's not necessarily going to work. You have to expand the economies, which means that you're going to have more investment in them. So there's a variety of lessons that come out of these, but it's basically to say, when anybody thinks this time it's different, you just say, nuts, it's not different. It's going to be the same as it was the last time, and we've got to take measures to keep these things from going. Another part of this is that what Mr. Carney tried to do as the Bank of Canada governor was basically make more money available to the economy. But two things happened that he didn't want to happen. Maybe that's why he's gone to England. But the one thing that happened was he wanted businesses to spend and invest, and they didn't. And he wanted the public to stop spending and spending over their heads, and they kept on spending. So the result of easier monetary policies is to do the exact opposite of what they expected to happen. And now you have a situation where Mr. Flaherty has to take action on that, and he started to do it, and it is painful, and house prices are coming down, and they're going to continue to come down if he takes up the money for them. But maybe it's something that's necessary so that you don't have a crash.
Okay, great. So I have a little bit of a comment/question here for you. I'm not convinced that that all economic social policy decisions are made with the thought that inequality will increase. How would you explain the draconian changes to Canada's employment insurance, first by Paul Martin in the 90s, then more recently by Jim Flaherty? Also, inattention to social programs, no change to social assistance rates over a long period of time, say 15 years, can also be seen as allowing the growth of social inequality.
Yeah, I don't disagree with any of the comments, but I don't think they were done in order to increase inequality. In other words, their purpose might have been to reduce the amount of money going to poor people, which I think demonstrably is true. Social assistance, for example, had its last real increase in 1993. I mean, that's the year where Kim Campbell became Prime Minister and Shania Twain released her first album. You know, this is a long time ago, and it'd take a 56% increase in social assistance rates to bring them back to what they were in 1993. But I would still say that that wasn't done in order to increase inequality. It was its consequence was it increased inequality. And the same is true for cuts in EI. It's a consequence of those policies that created inequality, but they were done for different reasons. That would be my point.
Okay, great. And I just have another question here. What did you mean when you said Gilded Age?
Oh, Gilded Age generally refers to the period in the latter part of the 19th century and the early part of the 20th century in the U.S., where a number of extremely powerful and very, very rich men controlled the vast part of the American economy, especially those that build the railways, and when the discovery of the internal combustion engine, and we started to have cars, and something that John D. Rockefeller owned, which was called oil. He was able to finally use gas for something other than kerosene lamps and became a very rich man. So what happened is they call it Gilded Age because all these people ended up living in Newport in Rhode Island with fantastic homes and castles, and putting on parties of absolutely obscene proportions, where millions of dollars, even in 19th century terms, were being spent on these extremely lavish week-long parties, and that just excess just knew no bounds, and so it became a Gilded Age. And now that we're seeing the top 1/10 of 1% of people with these fabulous amounts of wealth, we can see sort of a return of this type of lifestyle.
Okay, great. Okay, I think that's all the questions that we have for today, so I think we'll end a little bit early. I will be...
I could have gone slower.
No, you know what? I just got another question that popped up.
Okay.
In terms of the book titles put on the screen, I'll be sending out the PowerPoint presentation after the webinar is over, so you'll have the titles of the books for that. John, can you share examples of how to successfully frame inequality using the moral compass of the conservatives?
That's just about the hardest thing to do, but I think if we were to talk about liberty and talking about the very, very low levels of liberty that poor people have when they, when we have severe asset tests on their income, I think there's a case to be made there that's saying that they lose their liberty, that when we talk about sanctity, we can talk about the value of human beings and the value of their lives, and frame it in a way that when we talk about people who are doing less well than us, or the rest of us, is that that as a country we should have some loyalty to them just as people have loyalty to their children. I think we can frame the idea of authority, of government taking more responsibility for the role that they have in terms of making sure that everybody, in terms of the value of citizenship and residency in Ontario or Canada, are very important. And I think we can take what was the remaining one? But any one of those issues of liberty, loyalty, authority, and sanctity can be reframed, and we can look at the world in terms of that part of the moral palette, rather than, that's why I say, rather than continually hectoring people with a conservative mindset, saying, well, do you think that's fair, and don't you care about that? That's not the lens through which they're seeing the world. So I think there's ways to reframe it, but I think it's a lot of work. but I think it's work that's going to be worthwhile.
Okay, great. So that's the end of the questions that I have. So if anybody thinks of any other questions, you can just send either myself or John an email with the email addresses on the screen. So I just wanted to thank you very much, John, for coming in again. And your next webinar will be 3 weeks from now on the 29th, and I will send out that information in our post-webinar email to everyone, so if you'd like to sign up for that. And thank you, everybody, for joining us, and thank you very much, John.
Thanks.
Okay, bye-bye.